At 1036 hours on June 19, 1944.
Commander David McCampbell, 34 years old, strapped into the cockpit of his Grumman F-6F Hellcat fighter at 23,000 feet above the Philippine Sea, watching the largest air armada he'd ever seen approaching from the west. McCampbell counted the bogies on his radar scope. 70, no 80, no more than 100 Japanese aircraft in this wave alone. His radio was screaming with reports of 2 more raids behind this one.
350 Japanese planes inbound total.
McCampbell had exactly 7 other Hellcats in his division.
8 American fighters against what looked like the entire Japanese Naval Air Force.
McCampbell knew exactly what every other pilot in Task Force 58 was thinking right now. The same thing they'd been saying for 2 years, that David McCampbell was too old for this, too cautious, too analytical. Fighter combat required the reflexes of a 22-year-old farm boy, not the deliberation of a 34-year-old academy graduate who'd spent the first 3 years of the war teaching students at flight school while younger men earned their combat credentials. Captain Jocko Clark commanding USS Essex had told McCampbell 6 months ago when he made him Commander Air Group, "You're a fine administrator.
But you need to be more aggressive. Need to think less and shoot more."
The Nugget pilots in Fighting 15.
Kids fresh from Pensacola who were 19 and 20 years old.
Called McCampbell the old man behind his back. Made jokes about whether his reflexes were still sharp enough to dogfight Zeros. Whether a guy who'd graduated Annapolis in
1933 could keep up with the war that younger men were winning. McCampbell had heard every word of it. Had felt every doubt. Had wondered himself whether he'd waited too long. Whether spending 1942 and 1943
as a flight instructor while the Navy's aces were made at Guadalcanal and Rabaul meant he'd missed his war. But McCampbell had kept flying.
Had kept training.
Had kept studying the after-action reports from every carrier engagement. Had kept analyzing what separated the pilots who survived from the pilots who died. And McCampbell had discovered something that no one wanted to hear, that fighter combat wasn't about reflexes and aggression.
It was about geometry and patience. About understanding angles and energy states.
About seeing the whole tactical picture instead of fixating on the target in front of you. But try explaining that to a squadron full of 20-year-olds who thought combat was about balls and guts.
Try convincing your carrier captain that the 34-year-old CAG could teach young hotshots how to fight.
Now, at 1037 hours on June 19,
1944.
McCampbell was about to prove them all right or wrong.
The Japanese formation was 40 miles out and closing at 250 knots.
McCampbell keyed his radio, "Okay boys, here they come.
Remember what I taught you, don't chase, set up the geometry and let them fly into your bullets."
McCampbell heard one of his nuggets, Ensign Rusty Murray, 20 years old, 6 weeks in the squadron, key his radio. The fear in Murray's voice was palpable. "Skipper, there's gotta be 100 of them." "Doesn't matter how many there are, Murray," McCampbell replied, keeping his voice steady.
"Matters how many you can see at once. Stay high, stay fast, use your altitude advantage." McCampbell checked his own aircraft.
Checked that his 6 Browning .50 caliber machine guns were armed. Checked that his ammunition counters showed 400 rounds per gun, 2,400 rounds total. Checked that his fuel was good for 2 hours of combat. Then McCampbell looked west and saw them coming. Saw the Japanese formation at 35 miles.
Saw them on radar and then saw them visually.
A massive gaggle of aircraft at 18,000 feet. Mitsubishi A6M0s mixed with Nakajima B6N torpedo bombers mixed with Yokosuka D4Y dive bombers. All of them heading directly toward Task Force 58. Toward the 15 American aircraft carriers steaming below. Carriers that held the entire striking power of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. The Japanese knew this was their chance to reverse Midway. To sink American carriers and regain naval superiority. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commanding the Japanese First Mobile Fleet, had launched every aircraft he could get airborne. Had stripped his 9 carriers of their defensive fighters to create the largest strike force possible. 430 aircraft in 4 waves. McCampbell was looking at the first wave right now. 109 aircraft. McCampbell's tactical brain started calculating. 109 enemies. Approximately 200 American fighters defending the fleet. Which meant each American pilot would face maybe 1 or 2 enemies if everyone engaged perfectly. But combat was never perfect. Some pilots would miss the intercept. Some would chase targets out of position. Some would die in the first 30 seconds. McCampbell had to assume his 8-plane division would end up fighting alone. 8 Hellcats against whatever portion of the Japanese formation came their way. At 1,039 hours, McCampbell made the call, "All Hellcats, this is McCampbell. Attack when ready. Come from high side. Use 1 pass then zoom back to altitude. Do not dogfight at their altitude." It was the doctrine he'd been teaching for 6 months. The doctrine that Captain Clark said was too cautious. The doctrine that every hotshot pilot in the squadron thought was overcomplicated. But McCampbell had studied the numbers. Had read every after-action report. Had calculated the energy equations. And McCampbell knew the pilot who kept his altitude and speed would survive. The pilot who chased targets down into turning dogfights would die. Now, with 109 Japanese aircraft 30 miles away, McCampbell was about to test his theory with 99 lives on the line. McCampbell pushed his stick forward and felt his Hellcat's nose drop. Felt the airspeed build from 180 knots to 280 knots as he dove from 23,000 feet toward the Japanese formation 5,000 feet below. McCampbell picked his target carefully. Not the closest aircraft or the most threatening aircraft, but the 0 on the far left edge of the formation. The trail aircraft where McCampbell's attack angle would put the sun behind him and make him invisible until the last second. This was geometry. Pure physics. The Japanese pilot would never see him coming. At 1,040 hours, McCampbell opened fire at 400 yards. Saw his tracers walk into the 0's fuselage. Saw pieces fly off. Saw the 0's canopy shatter. Saw the aircraft roll inverted and fall away trailing smoke. Kill number 1. McCampbell didn't watch it die. Didn't follow it down to confirm the kill. Instead, McCampbell kept his speed up. Zoomed back to altitude using the energy from his dive. Climbed back to 24,000 feet and looked for his second target. Below him, chaos. The Japanese formation was dissolving as more American fighters arrived. Hellcats and 0's tangled at 18,000 feet. Bombers breaking formation and jettisoning their ordnance. And McCampbell saw what he'd predicted. Most of the American fighters were down at the Japanese altitude now. Were turning and burning with 0's in classic dogfights. Were doing exactly what McCampbell had told his pilots not to do. Were giving up their altitude and speed advantage to fight on the enemy's terms.
McCampbell watched a Hellcat get shot down. Watched the American fighter take 20mm cannon hits and explode. Watched the pilot who'd been too aggressive, too eager, pay for his impatience. McCampbell keyed his radio, Fighting 15, stay high. Do not chase them down. Use boom and zoom. Then McCampbell dove again. Selected another 0, this one at 17,000 feet climbing to engage a Hellcat above. McCampbell came down at 300 knots from the 6 o'clock high position. The classic perch attack. McCampbell fired a 3-second burst at 300 yards. Saw his bullets stitch across the Zero's wing root. Saw the wing fold. Saw the aircraft snap roll and tumble. Kill number 2. McCampbell zoomed back up. Back to safety. Back to altitude. At 1,043 hours, McCampbell had 2 kills and hadn't been shot at once. Because he was fighting smart. Fighting the geometry. Staying above the merge where Japanese pilots couldn't reach him. McCampbell looked for his division. Looked for the 7 Hellcats that should be following his example. He saw 3 of them high at 22,000 feet doing exactly what he'd taught them. Saw Ensign Murray executing a perfect boom and zoom attack. But he also saw 4 of his pilots down at 15,000 feet mixing it up with zeros. Saw them dogfighting. Saw them winning because the F-6F Hellcat was faster and tougher than the Zero. But also saw them vulnerable. Saw them burning fuel and ammunition on low-percentage shots. Then McCampbell's radar operator on Essex radioed, "McCampbell, this is Grim Reaper. Second wave inbound. Bearing 270, range 60 miles. Estimate 200 aircraft." The battle was just beginning. McCampbell felt his stomach tighten. 250 American fighters had engaged the first wave. Most of those fighters were now low on fuel or ammunition or both. Which meant the second wave would face maybe 100 fresh defenders. The odds were getting worse. McCampbell keyed his radio, all fighting 15 aircraft, disengage and reform at Angels 25. Second wave inbound. We need to regroup. McCampbell climbed to 25,000 feet and waited for his division to rejoin. At 1,048 hours, McCampbell counted his aircraft. 6 Hellcats. 2 missing. McCampbell didn't have time to wonder if they were dead or just separated because the second wave was visible now. 40 miles out. Even larger than the first. McCampbell could see on his radar scope that this wave was different. More organized. Had fighter escort high above the bombers. Had learned from the first wave's mistakes. McCampbell realized that the Japanese weren't amateurs. Weren't the poorly trained replacement pilots everyone said they were. These were veterans from the carriers that survived Philippine Sea. These were the same pilots who'd fought at Santa Cruz and Eastern Solomons. McCampbell adjusted his tactics. They've got high cover this time. Expect zeros above the bombers. Stay higher than their high cover. We need altitude advantage. At 1,052 hours, McCampbell climbed to 27,000 feet. Climbed until his Hellcat was struggling in the thin air. Until his engine was gasping for oxygen. But McCampbell needed that altitude. Because altitude was life. Altitude was energy. Altitude was the advantage that let him dictate the engagement. Then the second wave was on them. McCampbell saw 60 Japanese aircraft at 20,000 feet. Saw another 40 Zeros at 24,000 feet flying cover.
and McCampbell was above them all at 27,000 feet.
"Here we go," McCampbell transmitted. "Drop tanks and engage."
McCampbell punched off his external fuel tanks.
Felt them fall away.
Felt his Hellcat get lighter and more maneuverable.
McCampbell rolled inverted and pulled.
Split SD down toward a 0 at 24,000 feet.
Built speed to 320 knots. Came down out of the sun.
McCampbell fired at 250 yards.
Short burst. Kill number 3. McCampbell zoomed back up. But this time a 0 followed him.
This time a Japanese pilot anticipated McCampbell's maneuver and climbed after him.
McCampbell felt bullet impacts. Felt 7.7 millimeters rounds hit his Hellcat's tail.
Felt the aircraft shudder. For the first time that day, McCampbell had been hit.
McCampbell broke hard left.
Pulled 6 GS, felt the blood drain from his head.
Felt tunnel vision closing in. McCampbell reversed right.
Broke the Zero's tracking solution.
The Japanese pilot couldn't follow the high G turn. Couldn't match the Hellcat's superior power-to-weight ratio at altitude.
McCampbell came around behind the 0 and fired.
The 0 exploded. Kill number 4.
At 1,056 hours, McCampbell was burning through his ammunition faster than he'd planned. Had fired maybe 800 rounds already. Had 1,600 rounds remaining. Had enough for maybe 6 more engagements if he was careful.
McCampbell looked down and saw the second wave starting to break through the American fighters. Saw Japanese bombers reaching the outer ring of destroyers. Saw anti-aircraft fire starting to blossom around the bombers. If those bombers reached the carriers, the entire Philippine Sea operation would be compromised.
McCampbell made a decision that would define his command. Instead of staying high and safe, instead of continuing to pick off easy targets from above, McCampbell pushed over into a steep dive. Went down to 18,000 feet where the bombers were. Went into the hornet's nest where Zeros were thick and dangerous.
McCampbell selected a Nakajima B-6NK torpedo bomber. Saw it carrying a Type 91 torpedo under its belly.
Saw it heading straight for Essex.
McCampbell's carrier.
McCampbell fired from 400 yards.
Long range for a deflection shot.
But McCampbell had practiced this shot 1,000 times as an instructor. Had taught gunnery to students for 3 years.
McCampbell led the target perfectly. Saw his bullets hit the Kate's engine. Saw the cowling disintegrate. Saw the bomber drop its torpedo early and turn away trailing fire. Kill number 5.
Then McCampbell was in the middle of the formation.
Was surrounded by Japanese aircraft. Was at their altitude where they had the advantage. McCampbell felt fear for the first time that day. Felt the cold certainty that he'd made a tactical mistake. That his desire to protect his carrier had put him in a position where his altitude and energy advantage was gone. Where he was just another target. But then McCampbell saw Ensign Murray, his 20-year-old nugget, come diving down from above. Saw Murray execute the perfect boom and zoom attack McCampbell had taught him. Saw Murray shoot down a Zero that had been lining up on McCampbell's 6. McCampbell realized that his division had followed him down. Had abandoned safety to support their commander. McCampbell felt something like pride. Because these kids, these nuggets everyone said were too inexperienced, were fighting like veterans. Were thinking tactically. Were using the discipline McCampbell had drilled into them.
At 1,059 hours, McCampbell shot down his 6th aircraft.
Another 0.
Then his 7th, a dive bomber. And his 8th, a 0 that made the mistake of turning with a Hellcat at altitude.
McCampbell's ammunition counters showed 400 rounds remaining. Enough for maybe 2 more kills.
Then McCampbell heard Grim Reaper radio, all fighters, 3rd wave inbound.
Bearing 265, range 50 miles. Estimate 150 aircraft.
McCampbell looked at his fuel gauge.
40 minutes remaining. Looked at his ammunition counters. 400 rounds.
McCampbell knew he should break off.
Should return to Essex and rearm and refuel.
But McCampbell also knew that if every fighter with low fuel and ammunition returned to base right now, the 3rd wave would break through unopposed. Would reach the carriers and sink them. McCampbell made his second defining decision: he'd stay on station.
Would fight with whatever ammunition he had left.
Would keep the Japanese away from the carriers until his tanks ran dry. McCampbell reformed his division.
Counted 5 Hellcats now. 1 more missing.
Anyone critically low on fuel or ammo, return to base, McCampbell transmitted.
Everyone else, we're going again. Not 1 pilot left. Every one of them stayed.
McCampbell felt his throat tighten.
Because these were men. Real men. Doing the impossible.
At 1,104 hours, the 3rd wave arrived. The 3rd wave was smaller than the first 2 waves.
The Japanese were running out of aircraft.
Were launching everything they had left. McCampbell saw the formation was ragged.
Saw the pilots were less experienced. Saw them flying too tight. Not scanning. Making rookie mistakes.
McCampbell realized that Japan had already lost this battle.
Had thrown their best pilots at the American fleet in the first 2 waves.
And now they were sending in the replacements.
The undertrained kids who'd gotten 20 hours of flight time before being shoved into combat. McCampbell felt something like pity. Because he knew what was about to happen.
Knew these Japanese pilots were dead men flying.
But pity didn't stop McCampbell from diving on them.
Didn't stop him from firing his remaining 400 rounds into a 0 at close range.
Watching it disintegrate. Kill number 9. McCampbell's guns clicked empty at 1,107 hours.
Winchester, McCampbell transmitted.
I'm out of ammo. Returning to base.
But before McCampbell could turn away, he saw a 0 line up on Murray's Hellcat.
Saw the Japanese pilot tracking perfectly. Saw Murray didn't see the threat.
McCampbell had no ammunition. But McCampbell still had his aircraft. Still had 2,000 pounds of Hellcat.
McCampbell dove on the 0.
Came down at full throttle. McCampbell flew his Hellcat within 20 feet of the 0. Close enough that the Japanese pilot saw McCampbell's aircraft filling his peripheral vision. Close enough that the 0 pilot flinched and broke off his attack.
Broke hard right and dove away. Murray survived because his commander was willing to use his aircraft as a weapon even without ammunition. The moment crystallized everything McCampbell had been trying to teach. Combat wasn't about firepower or aggression. It was about will. About commitment. About protecting your wingman even when your guns were empty.
At 1,109 hours, McCampbell turned toward Essex.
Turned toward home.
As McCampbell flew east, he looked back and saw the battle continuing.
Saw more Hellcats arriving.
Saw the Japanese third wave getting shredded. Saw aircraft falling from the sky trailing smoke. Saw the ocean below dotted with splashes where aircraft had hit the water. McCampbell counted the splashes. 30.
No, 40. No more. Lost count. McCampbell realized he was watching the destruction of Japanese naval aviation. Was watching the end of Japan's carrier force as an offensive weapon. Because even if the Japanese carriers survived this battle, they'd have no aircraft and no trained pilots to operate from those carriers. The strategic implications were staggering. Without carrier-based air support, Japan couldn't defend the Marianas. Couldn't defend the Philippines. Couldn't defend Okinawa.
The path to Tokyo was open. And it had happened in one afternoon.
In approximately 4 hours of combat. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, pilots were already calling it. Because the Japanese aircraft had been easy targets. Like turkeys at a shooting gallery. But McCampbell knew the truth.
It wasn't that the Japanese were easy. It was that the American tactics were superior.
The Hellcat was superior. Training was superior.
McCampbell's insistence on altitude and boom and zoom instead of turning dogfights had kept American losses to 29 aircraft while inflicting losses that Japan could never replace. When McCampbell landed on Essex at 1,127 hours, his Hellcat had 3 bullet holes in the tail.
Had empty ammunition boxes.
Had 22 minutes of fuel remaining.
22 minutes.
That's how close McCampbell had cut it. When McCampbell climbed out of his cockpit, his flight suit was soaked with sweat.
His hands were shaking from adrenaline.
Captain Clark was waiting on the flight deck.
Clark looked at McCampbell. How many?
9 confirmed, sir, McCampbell replied.
Maybe 10. Clark's eyes went wide. 9 kills in one mission was extraordinary. Was almost unheard of. Was the kind of performance that made legends. Did you get hit?
Clark asked. McCampbell pointed at the bullet holes in his tail.
Caught some rounds from a zero at 24,000 feet. I got sloppy. Clark laughed. Actually laughed. McCampbell, you just shot down 9 Japanese aircraft and you're calling yourself sloppy?
I let him get a shot at me, sir, McCampbell said.
That's unacceptable. Clark shook his head. The old man still got it.
But this time the nickname wasn't an insult. Was said with respect.
With admiration.
Over the next 3 hours, as the battle continued, McCampbell stood in flag plot and watched radar screens. Listened to radio calls.
Counted Japanese aircraft destroyed. 50. 100. 200.
By 1500 hours, when the last Japanese aircraft either fled or died, the count was over 300.
Was closer to 350. Was the complete annihilation of Ozawa's attack force.
The American pilots who'd fought that day started calling it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot.
Because the Japanese aircraft had been easy targets. Like turkeys at a shooting gallery. But McCampbell knew the real story. The reason why. It was the F-6F Hellcat itself. The aircraft that Grumman had designed specifically to kill Zeros. 6 Browning .50 caliber machine guns. 2,400 rounds of ammunition. 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney engine. Self-sealing fuel tanks.
Armor plating protecting the pilot.
The Hellcat was faster than the Zero. could dive faster, could absorb more damage, could carry more ammunition. But the Hellcats' real advantage wasn't mechanical. It was tactical. The Hellcat was designed to fight from altitude, to use boom and zoom tactics, to exploit energy advantages, to turn the geometry of air combat into a mathematical equation where the American pilot always won. McCampbell had understood this from the beginning, had studied the Hellcats' performance envelope, had calculated the optimal combat tactics, had trained his pilots to fight the Hellcats' fight, not the Zeros' fight. Stay high. Stay fast. Use altitude advantage. One pass, then zoom back up. Don't dogfight. Don't turn. Let the enemy make mistakes, then exploit those mistakes with superior energy. It was physics. Pure physics. The pilot who understood the physics won. The pilot who relied on aggression and reflexes lost. And McCampbell had proven it today. 9 kills. Not because he was the fastest or the youngest or the most aggressive, but because he was the smartest, the most disciplined, the most patient. McCampbell had turned air combat into science. And science beat courage every time. Over the next 2 days, as Task Force 58 pursued the fleeing Japanese carriers, as American bombers sank the carrier Hio and crippled 2 others, the strategic situation in the Pacific shifted permanently. Because after the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, Japan's carrier force was finished, was no longer capable of offensive operations. The path to the Philippines and Okinawa and eventually Japan itself was open. When Essex returned to Pearl Harbor in July 1944, McCampbell was promoted to full commander and awarded the Navy Cross. His second. Reporters asked him how a 34-year-old had outfought pilots 10 years younger. Fighter combat isn't about age, McCampbell said. It's about tactics and discipline. The pilot who thinks before shooting beats the pilot who shoots before thinking every time. It was the lesson McCampbell had been trying to teach for 6 months. The lesson that young hotshots didn't want to hear. The lesson that Captain Clark had dismissed as too cautious. But the scoreboard didn't lie. 9 kills in 29 minutes. 0 losses. McCampbell's division had shot down more Japanese aircraft per pilot than any other unit in Task Force 58. The tactics worked. The geometry worked. The discipline worked. Age didn't matter. Reflexes didn't matter. What mattered was understanding the physics of combat and having the discipline to execute the tactics even when every instinct said to charge in and start shooting. McCampbell had proven that the oldest pilot in the squadron could be the deadliest. Because wisdom beat youth. Experience beat aggression. Patience beat recklessness. And the 6 Browning machine guns in the Hellcats' wings, those were the tools that turned McCampbell's tactical wisdom into Japanese aircraft falling from the sky. McCampbell continued flying combat missions. Continued leading Air Group 15. And by October 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, McCampbell would shoot down 9 more aircraft in a single day. Would bring his total to 34 confirmed kills, making him the U.S. Navy's highest-scoring ace of World War II. More kills than any other naval aviator in history. The tactics McCampbell developed and taught, the boom and zoom approach that prioritized altitude and energy management over dogfighting, became standard doctrine in the Navy's fighter training program. Every naval aviator who graduated from Pensacola after 1944 learned McCampbell's principles: maintain altitude, conserve energy, one pass and zoom back up. Let the enemy make mistakes. Don't dogfight. Don't turn. Use your advantages. Fight smart, not hard. McCampbell's performance during the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, those 9 kills in one mission, became the case study for how experience and tactical thinking could overcome youth and reflexes. Because McCampbell at 34, with his analytical approach and patient discipline, had outperformed pilots 10 years younger who relied on aggression and quick reflexes. The myth that fighter pilots peaked at 25 was destroyed by the 34-year-old who proved that knowledge and tactics beat youth and speed. After the war, McCampbell commanded the carrier Franklin D. Roosevelt. He retired from the Navy as a captain in 1964. He lived until 1996. Died at age 86. At his funeral, naval aviators who'd never met him came to pay respects to the ace of aces. The man who'd proven that the oldest pilot in the squadron could become the deadliest. Today at the Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola, there's a Hellcat painted in McCampbell's colors. Bureau number 58418. The aircraft he flew on June 19, 1944. Mounted next to the aircraft is McCampbell's flight log from that day, showing 9 confirmed kills between 10:40 and 11:09 hours. 29 minutes of combat that changed naval aviation doctrine forever. The placard reads, Commander David McCampbell, USS Essex CAG-15, Battle of Philippine Sea. The pilot they said was too old, who proved that tactics beat reflexes, who shot down more enemy aircraft than any naval aviator in history. Every pilot who walks past that display understands that McCampbell's legacy isn't just the 34 kills or the Navy Cross or the Medal of Honor he eventually received. It's the principle he proved, that combat effectiveness doesn't peak in your 20s. That experience and judgment are force multipliers. That the patient hunter kills more game than the aggressive charger. McCampbell's Bumanzum doctrine, the insistence on altitude and energy management, is still taught at fighter weapons school today. Because the geometry of air combat hasn't changed. Physics is physics. Whether you're flying a Hellcat in 1944 or an F/A-18 in 2024. The Turkey Shoot itself, that battle on June 19, 1944, where 350 Japanese aircraft died against 29 American losses, that wasn't luck or technological superiority alone. It was McCampbell's tactical approach multiplied across 200 Hellcat pilots. It was discipline beating aggression. It was thinking beating feeling. It was the 34-year-old instructor who became the deadliest fighter pilot in naval history by teaching his students that patience kills more enemies than bravery. When historians study the Pacific War's turning points, they cite Midway in Guadalcanal and Iwo Jima. But they often miss the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Miss the battle where Japan's naval aviation died completely and irreversibly. Where the carriers that survived had no aircraft to operate. Where the pilots who survived were too few and too traumatized to rebuild. And they missed the role that David McCampbell played in that destruction. The role of the old man who was supposed to be past his prime. But instead became the instrument through which American air superiority was established permanently. McCampbell's 9 kills on June 19 weren't just personal achievement. They were proof of concept. Were the validation of tactics that would save hundreds of American lives in the months ahead as Fighting 15 and every other squadron adopted his methods. The estimated casualties prevented by ending Japanese carrier operations after the Turkey Shoot, that number runs into the thousands. Because without carrier-based air support, the Japanese couldn't defend the Marianas effectively. Couldn't defend the Philippines. Couldn't defend Okinawa. couldn't contest the island-hopping campaign that brought B-29s within range of the Japanese home islands. All of that strategic collapse traces back to June 19, 1944. Traces back to the day when David McCampbell and 200 other Hellcat pilots destroyed Japanese naval aviation in an afternoon. McCampbell's personal contribution to that victory, his 9 kills and his leadership and his tactical doctrine, that was the performance of a 34-year-old man whom everyone had said was too old for fighters, too analytical for combat, too cautious for war. McCampbell proved them wrong by becoming the deadliest fighter pilot in U.S. Navy history. By shooting down 34 enemy aircraft. By surviving 2 years of intense combat without being shot down once. By teaching a generation of pilots that thinking beats reacting. That geometry beats aggression. That the oldest man in the squadron can be the most dangerous warrior if he fights smart instead of fighting hard. When you visit the National Museum of Naval Aviation and you see McCampbell's Hellcat and you read his combat record, remember this: this was the man they called too old. This was the pilot who spent 3 years teaching while others earned glory. This was the commander who at 34 years old proved that experience and discipline and tactical intelligence matter more than youth and reflexes and aggressive instinct. Remember that on June 19, 1944, during those 29 minutes between 10:40 and 11:09 hours, David McCampbell killed 9 enemy aircraft and helped destroy Japanese naval aviation forever. And he did it not by being the fastest or the youngest or the most aggressive pilot in the sky, but by being the smartest, the most patient, the most disciplined. The pilot who understood that fighter combat was physics and geometry and tactics, not just courage and aggression. That understanding, that tactical maturity that only comes with age and experience, that was what won the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. That was what destroyed 350 Japanese aircraft in one afternoon. That was what ended Japan's carrier operations permanently. And that was what proved that David McCampbell, the 34-year-old man they said was too old for war, was actually exactly the right age to win it. The 5 minutes that destroyed 4 carriers at Midway began with Wade McCluskey trusting his navigation instincts. The 29 minutes that destroyed Japanese naval aviation at Philippine Sea began with David McCampbell trusting his tactical doctrine. Both men were told they were wrong. Both men were doubted by their superiors. Both men were considered inadequate by younger, more aggressive officers. Both men proved that competence and wisdom beat youth and aggression every single time. McCampbell's legacy lives in every fighter weapons school graduate who learns boom and zoom tactics. Lies in every naval aviator who climbs to altitude before engaging. Lies in every pilot who understands that patience is a weapon. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot ended Japanese naval aviation as an offensive force. But it began with one 34-year-old commander who refused to believe that age disqualified him from combat. Who refused to fight the enemy's fight. Who refused to abandon discipline for aggression. Who proved that the oldest man in the squadron could shoot down more enemy aircraft than anyone else. 9 kills in 29 minutes. 34 kills total. The U.S. Navy's ace of aces. Not despite his age. Because of it. Because David McCampbell understood what younger pilots didn't, that fighter combat is won before the first shot is fired. Won by the pilot who positions himself correctly. Who maintains his energy. Who fights smart. Who thinks before he shoots. That was David McCampbell. That was the man they said was too old. That was the ace of aces.